The Disappearance. It was a perfect summer day, the kind of day that felt safe and warm. The waves softly lapped at the shore, and little Sarah was in her element, building sandcastles by the lake's edge, her giggles filling the air. Her parents, sitting on a nearby bench under the shade of a tree, chatted idly, keeping a relaxed eye on her as she sculpted the sand into her newest masterpiece. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, the forest bordering it like a dark curtain. It was thick and quiet, unnaturally so, as if it swallowed all sound that came too close. But Sarah didn't seem to notice, absorbed in her work, using seashells to decorate her creation. Every so often, she'd wave excitedly at her parents, her blonde hair catching the breeze, and they'd wave back with smiles. Time drifted lazily, and the sun began its slow descent. Sarah's parents realized it had been a few minutes since they last saw her move. They stood up, scanning the beach. The sandcastle was still there, the small bucket and spade next to it. But Sarah was gone. A chill ran through her mother as she called out her name. "Sarah, sweetie, where are you?" There was no answer. The lake was still, no sign of disturbance. No footprints leading away from the water. Nothing. Her father hurried towards the spot where Sarah had been, his voice firm but edged with panic. "Sarah, come on, it's time to go." But there was no sign of their daughter. The sand, soft and untouched, showed no trace of where she could have gone. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. In the distance, the dark line of the forest stood, silent and menacing. "Maybe she went into the woods," her mother whispered, though even she didn't believe it. Something felt deeply wrong. But they had no other choice. They had to find her. They started walking towards the woods, the shadows of the trees stretching long and ominous over the beach. The silence seemed to grow heavier with every step. And from deep within the trees, something was watching them. The trees loomed closer as Sarah's parents stepped cautiously into the thick underbrush, the warmth of the day quickly fading into a cold, unnatural chill. The forest was dense, suffocating, its branches gnarled like twisted fingers reaching down from the sky. Not even a breeze rustled the leaves. Everything was unnervingly still. Each step felt wrong, as if they were intruding on something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. "Sarah," her mother called again, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive quiet. There was no echo, no response. Only silence. The kind of silence that pressed against their eardrums, making them hyper-aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeat. Then, out of nowhere, a soft rustle. Her father whipped his head toward the sound, eyes wide, but there was nothing. Just the trees, staring back at them with their knotted bark. "Do you hear that?" her mother whispered, gripping his arm. "It's too quiet. It's like there's nothing here." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. Her father spun around, eyes darting. A branch, thick and heavy, had fallen on the path behind them, though there had been no wind, no reason for it to fall. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. As they pressed deeper into the forest, they became aware of the absence of life. No birds called, no insects buzzed. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. Then, something moved in the periphery, something quick and silent. Her mother gasped, clutching her husband's hand tightly. "Did you see that?" she breathed, eyes wide with terror. Before he could answer, a low hiss broke the silence. They looked down to see a snake, coiled and watching, its black eyes glittering with something too intelligent, too knowing. Its tongue flickered in and out, tasting the air as though it was searching for something. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it slithered into the undergrowth, disappearing like a shadow. They pressed on, hearts pounding. The trees seemed to close in on them, and with every step, the forest grew darker, even though the sun had not yet fully set. The silence was broken by a sudden rush of wings. Birds, dozens of them, shot out from the trees overhead, screeching in terror as they fled some unseen force. "What the hell is happening?" her father whispered, his voice shaking. He could feel it now, the weight of something wrong hanging in the air, something watching them. Out of the corner of his eye, something large moved. He turned just in time to see a wolf, sleek and silver, dart between the trees. It moved unnaturally fast, almost too fast, and it didn't look back. Wolves weren't supposed to be here. They hadn't seen one in this area in years. The wolf stopped suddenly, just a few yards ahead, its eyes glowing a faint amber in the growing gloom. It stared at them, motionless, its gaze almost human. Then, just as quickly, it bolted again, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. They were both shaking now, the fear wrapping itself around their throats, making it hard to breathe. The forest seemed alive with something that didn't belong. And then, cutting through the silence like a knife, they heard it. A laugh. Not a normal laugh, but a high-pitched giggle, echoing unnaturally through the trees, as though it was bouncing from trunk to trunk. It wasn't Sarah's voice, but it was a child's. The sound twisted and stretched, filling the air, wrapping around them until they couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her mother clutched her chest, gasping, That wasn't her. What is that?" Another giggle. Closer this time. Too close. It sounded distorted, like a tape played backward. "Sarah!" her father shouted, his voice breaking. "Sarah, if that's you, answer us." The only answer was the echoing laugh, growing louder and more distorted, until it became something inhuman. A cacophony of voices, all laughing, all wrong. Then, silence again. They were standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by nothingness, and yet, they weren't alone. A shadow flickered at the edge of their vision, just behind a tree, barely there. And with it, came the distinct feeling that they were being lured. "Don't move," her father whispered, his voice barely audible over the thundering of his heart. "Don't look away." The wood seemed endless, every tree a carbon copy of the last, and Sarah's parents trudged forward, terrified but determined. The strange laughter had stopped, but its eerie echo still clung to their thoughts like a thick fog. Every so often, they'd hear the faint crunch of leaves underfoot that didn't belong to them, footsteps from something unseen, always just behind, just out of reach. "Sarah!" her mother whispered, almost as if speaking her name any louder would bring back that horrible laugh. Then, from somewhere up ahead, they saw it, a flash of color in the dull grays and greens of the forest. A small figure huddled at the base of a tree. Sarah. She sat there, her back to them, motionless. "Sarah!" her father called out, his voice cracking with both relief and fear. They rushed forward, but with every step they took, the forest seemed to grow darker, as if the trees themselves were pulling the light away. The shadows stretched long and sinister, curling toward them like hungry fingers. As they reached Sarah, her mother dropped to her knees, reaching out to touch her daughter's shoulder. But something stopped her. An icy coldness washed over her, freezing her in place. Her fingers hovered inches from Sarah, but she couldn't bring herself to close the distance. Sarah's head slowly turned, her blonde hair falling away from her face. Her eyes were empty, wide, glassy, and void of life. She stared straight through them, her lips twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. "Sarah!" her mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" Before they could move or say another word, Sarah's head snapped back forward, her body jerking violently like a puppet on strings. Then, she stood up. Slowly, mechanically. Her father tried to step forward, to grab her, but his legs wouldn't move. Panic seized him as he realized he was frozen in place. His muscles refused to obey, as if the forest itself had taken hold of him. He glanced at his wife. She, too, was rooted to the spot, her eyes wide with terror. Then, the forest came alive. From the corner of his eye, her father saw movement, figures, dozens of them, barely visible in the shadows. They stood between the trees, their shapes indistinct, but he could feel their eyes on him, burning holes into his soul. They shifted and flickered, as if they weren't fully there. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was no longer his own. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay. And from the darkness, a low, guttural whisper rose, though he couldn't make out the words. It was as if the forest itself was speaking, mocking them. And then came the figures. Tall, too tall to be human, their limbs elongated and grotesque, emerged from the shadows. Their faces were obscured by the gloom, but their glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, unblinking and inhuman. They moved unnaturally, their bodies swaying as if they were being pushed by some unseen force. One of them stepped closer, its long fingers brushing against a tree, and as it did, the bark turned black, rotting away before their eyes. A horrible, unnatural groan echoed from above. Her father forced his eyes upward, and what he saw made his stomach churn. The trees were moving. No, not moving, breathing. Their trunks swelled and contracted as though they had lungs, and the branches twisted together, forming grotesque faces in the canopy above, eyes and mouths wide open in a silent scream. A crackling sound filled the air, and suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. The forest floor seemed to ripple like water, and from the earth, hands began to push through the dirt, pale, skeletal hands, clawing at the air. They reached for Sarah's parents, grasping at their ankles, but they couldn't move to escape. "Sarah!" her mother sobbed, struggling against the invisible force that held her. But Sarah didn't respond. She stood there, unmoving, her glassy eyes staring into nothingness. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them. It wasn't coming from any direction in particular, it was everywhere. The figures between the trees began to sway in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural, like they were being controlled by the same puppeteer who had hold of Sarah. Suddenly, Sarah turned around, her blank eyes locking onto her parents. She took a step toward them, her body moving stiffly, her limbs bending at unnatural angles. "Mommy," she said, her voice distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Why did you leave me?" Her mother's heart shattered at the sound of her daughter's voice, but it wasn't right. It sounded wrong, hollow, like an echo of something that used to be Sarah. And then, Sarah smiled, a wide, terrifying grin that stretched too far, her cheeks pulling back in a grotesque mockery of joy. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the forest erupted with noise. The trees groaned, the hands clawed at the earth, and a loud crack sounded from deep within the woods, a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Her father managed to tear his eyes away from the nightmare unfolding before him just in time to see something impossible. In the distance, a massive, twisted figure loomed, an impossibly tall silhouette, with branches for arms and a head made of woven roots. It stood silently, watching them, its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The forest fell into silence once more. The hands sank back into the earth, the figures between the trees dissolved into the shadows, and Sarah, their sweet little girl, collapsed onto the ground. They could move again. Her father rushed forward, scooping Sarah into his arms. She was limp, her skin cold as ice, but she was breathing. She was alive. But the forest was watching them still. With Sarah limp in his arms, her father didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, his wife struggling to keep up beside him. The monstrous figure in the distance loomed like a living nightmare, its twisted body blending with the trees, watching, waiting. The forest had shifted, the path back disappearing into an endless tangle of branches and thorns. Every direction seemed the same, but instinct drove them forward, away from that towering thing, away from the suffocating whispers, away from whatever Sarah had become. "Don't look back!" her father shouted, his voice ragged with panic. But it was hard not to. The air behind them seemed to crackle with malevolence, like the forest itself was closing in, desperate to drag them back. Sarah's mother stumbled, almost falling, but she pushed herself up with trembling hands, fear giving her the strength to keep going. The trees blurred past them, and the light was fading faster than it should have. Time was wrong here, everything was wrong. Her father's arms ached from holding Sarah, but he refused to let go. He could feel her cold breath against his chest, her small, fragile body swaying with his steps. But something gnawed at him, something dark. Why had she collapsed like that? Why was she so cold? Behind them, the forest groaned, as if something massive was moving through it, the sound of splintering wood and rustling leaves getting louder. The creature, whatever it was following them, its grotesque form impossible to fully comprehend, but undeniably coming closer. Finally, they broke through the tree-line. The open field was in sight, the lake just beyond it. Freedom! They ran faster, hearts pounding in their ears, the sound of their ragged breaths drowning out everything else. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. "We're almost there," her mother gasped, tears streaming down her face. But as they reached the edge of the field, something changed. Sarah stirred. At first, it was just a twitch, a slight movement of her fingers. Her father didn't notice. He was too focused on getting away. But then, her eyes snapped open, and with a sudden, horrifying burst of strength, she grabbed him by the throat. "Sarah! What are you?" he choked, his feet stumbling as her small hand squeezed tighter than any child ever could. His body convulsed, and he fell to his knees, dropping her. Her mother screamed and rushed to pull Sarah off, but as soon as she touched her, Sarah flung her aside with a force that sent her crashing into a nearby tree. It was like something else had taken over their daughter, a strength that wasn't human. Sarah stood now, her movements stiff and unnatural, her eyes black as the void. The twisted grin returned to her face, stretching her skin too tightly across her cheekbones. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice layered with that same distorted echo from before. "He wants you." From the darkness of the forest, the ground trembled. The monstrous figure that had been watching from the trees began to emerge, its towering form almost blending with the shadows, branches twisting into grotesque shapes as it moved. The air thickened with the smell of rot and earth as it drew closer, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Her father gasped for breath, clawing at the ground, trying to crawl away, but Sarah's grip was unrelenting. She dragged him effortlessly across the grass, toward the thing waiting in the shadows. Her mother, barely conscious, tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature towered over them now, a horrible amalgamation of twisted wood and decaying flesh. Its eyes gleamed with malice, and its long, root-like fingers stretched toward Sarah and her father. "Don't take her," her father cried, his voice barely a whisper. She's just a child." But Sarah's face was no longer her own. That twisted smile, those hollow eyes, it wasn't her. Whatever had taken hold of her was no longer human. The last thing they heard before the world went dark was the sound of cracking bones and the low, guttural voice of the creature, whispering something in a language they could never hope to understand. The next morning, search parties found nothing. The beach, once bright and peaceful, now seemed haunted. People whispered of strange sounds coming from the woods at night. Laughter, whispers, the rustling of trees when there was no wind. But of Sarah and her parents, there was no trace. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole. Word spread quickly. Families stopped bringing their children to the lake. The woods became a place of whispered legends, a place to be feared. No one ventured too close after dark, not even the bravest hunters. It was said that if you listened carefully, you could still hear Sarah's giggle echoing through the trees, growing louder as the sun set. Months passed, and the house where Sarah's family had lived stood abandoned. It became a symbol of the loss, a place no one dared to go near. The windows were dark, the garden overgrown, and the front door hung open as if inviting something unseen inside. One night, without warning, the house caught fire. It burned quickly, too quickly. By the time anyone noticed, the flames had consumed it, leaving nothing but ash and charred wood behind. No one could explain how it started. There had been no storms, no lightning, nothing that could have sparked such destruction. But as the flames died down and the smoke cleared, something unsettling was found among the ruins. Scorched into the earth where the house had stood were the same twisted symbols that had been seen in the forest, the marks of the creature that had taken Sarah. And from that day on, no one dared speak of the family again. The forest was left untouched, a dark reminder of what had happened. And the laughter never stopped.